All right, there we go. And so let me jump right in, and I'm gonna talk about a few different things. There's not going to be a kind of singular focus to what I have to say, discuss with you today, but I do want to provide, if you will, a overarching framework. It's the framework I started to develop with you a couple of months ago when we were talking about the origins of democratic theory and practice, the constitutions that are for the most part, the models for the constitutions that organize the freer societies of the world today, and that those constitutions had their roots in certain Enlightenment ideals, and that in light of the 3 centuries of history under our belt since then, in light of advances in understanding of how the human mind and brain and reason operate, that it might be a good time to be reconsidering the relationship between the Enlightenment view of human nature and our democratic institutions, considering whether changes in our understanding of human nature might entail that we should also be revising democratic practice. And so I want to continue drawing on those themes, but then survey a number of items that are in the news currently from that perspective. So that's where we'll go today. I'm going to start out on a topic that we discussed a fair bit last week, and that is Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson's, it now appears, successful nomination to the Supreme Court by President Joseph Biden. She has not, in fact, been confirmed, but her confirmation hearings are complete, and it now appears that she has support of sufficient members of the Senate that she will, in fact, be confirmed. And I went through a number of issues with you last week that I thought were revealed both by the fact that her joining the court will in no way alter the stranglehold that justices who are by historical standards very far right are in control. The stranglehold that they have on the Supreme Court. She will be part of a minority of 3 more liberal justices. And that this means that although this is a historic development, an African-American woman gaining access to the highest legal institution in our land, it is not likely to be an important legal development for the foreseeable future in terms of its impact on controversial issues of jurisprudence. And in addition to that, I emphasized to you last week things to do with the nature of the confirmation hearings, and these are summarized in this list. I promise you I won't go through all of them again, but I suggested that what we needed to see when we looked at, in particular, the Republican lines of questioning, the ones that got the greatest attention and notoriety, is an effort to seed moral panic, that it would be appropriate to view the members of the Judiciary Committee from the Republican side who appear to have national or greater aspirations to be, in a sense, using the attention concentrated on a Supreme Court nomination, especially from the perspective of the Republican base, which has been focused on transforming the Supreme Court in order to overturn decisions like Roe v. Wade for at least a quarter century now. So these are events that really concentrate the attention of the Republican base, and so are very tempting for Republican senators who have presidential aspirations, that they see themselves, or we should see them, maybe is the better way to put it, as political entrepreneurs of moral panic. They're trying to really foment anxiety, anger, a sense that a world in which this woman might be on the Supreme Court is a world that is very hostile and foreign to the values and interests of the people whose vote they hope will propel them to the Republican nomination for the presidency. And I've suggested to you that the focus in particular, and I'm going to focus here for just a moment on allegations that Judge Brown Jackson, in her role as a trial judge, was lenient in the sentencing of those convicted of child pornography possession offenses, was a very good way to signal to their base that this is a dangerous world for their children that they live in, that they are sending their children to schools that are going to try to reprogram them with leftist ideology about race and about sexuality, and that the result is going to be that their children are going to come home different persons from the persons they were prior to being exposed to these institutions of liberal indoctrination. So that's one layer of moral panic seeding that was being performed by Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley in these hearings. But I now want to focus a little bit more on a second layer, and I did a little bit more research on this in the intervening week, and the connection between these allegations that she's lenient when it comes to sentencing those convicted of possession of child pornography, and in particular the QAnon conspiracy theory that is vital online and subscribed to by a distressingly large portion of the Republican base. And so first of all, just to note, right, that the entire federal judiciary, according to a 2021 report of the Federal Sentencing Commission, is in a sense lenient, but that Judge Brown Jackson's record is no more lenient than the judiciary is on average. And that in particular, as she explained in this hearing, it is because the standards, the federal standards, direct judges to exercise a certain amount of discretion in balancing, on the one hand, the need to enforce the law against those who have violated the law, and on the other hand, the need to try to, through punishment, not only uphold the law, but also rehabilitate the criminal. And that in a world in which pornography is widely and easily circulated via the internet, some of the people who the federal judiciary has to sentence are not as egregious in their offenses as perhaps it would have been in a pre-internet world, given the amount of porn that they possess and the ease of access that they have to it. And so again, Republican as well as Democratic appointed judges are sentencing on average below the statutory minimum because the circumstances have changed and their judgments, their verdicts, their sentences reflect their sense of those changed circumstances. But here's the bigger question, it seems to me. Why focus on this issue? It has absolutely nothing to do with Supreme Court jurisprudence and very little to do with Judge Brown Jackson's judicial philosophy or philosophy of constitutional interpretation. It is a technical issue, not a broad principled issue. And I think the answer to that, one I've already reviewed, is that it helps to signal, to trigger, if you will, a sense of moral panic about children that is being felt in rather wide circles on the right now, and so that there is a commonality between this line of questioning and the use of so-called critical race theory, or in the case of Judge Brown Jackson's interrogation, her role on the board of a school that has an anti-racist curriculum. These are of a kind. But there's a second dimension to this, which has to do with QAnon. And that's where I want to focus for a moment now. And one key aspect of the online disinformation community, right? The conspiracy theory community that is collected under the rubric of QAnon is this allegation, this almost laughable, if it weren't so widely believed, conspiracy theory that the Democratic elite are involved in a child sex trafficking ring, right? This is the conspiracy that led a man armed with an automatic rifle to go into a restaurant in Washington, D.C., looking for the headquarters of Hillary Clinton's child sex trafficking ring. And unfortunately, this conspiracy is believed by 25% of the registered voters in the United States. And when we get to that, it goes from being laughable to being deadly serious. There's a small percentage of the Biden supporters. This survey is from October 2020, so in the buildup to the 2020 presidential campaign, a small percentage of the Biden supporters who believe this. I'm really not sure how to make sense of that. But 50% of Trump supporters indicate that they believe this. Similarly, 52% believe that Trump is working to dismantle this Democrat-led sex trafficking ring. And so when the questions focus on whether Judge Brown Jackson has been too lenient when it comes to child porn, I think the innuendo here, and I think it's heard as such on the Republican right, in the QAnon community, is that the Democrats want a judge like Brown Jackson on the Supreme Court to protect their nefarious scheme, right? And so again, the degree to which this hearing seems to reveal to us that things are amiss in our democracy when senators find that it's to their advantage politically to dog whistle about extreme and basically totally inflammatory and incredible conspiracy theories in order to gain traction in the upcoming presidential primaries. Something is deeply broken about the public sphere, the information infrastructure of our democracy. I'm going to skip over this stuff. You've heard me talk about it a lot, but I want to come now to something that I think is going to help to tie things together for us a little bit. So if what I'm saying is in part that we need to be attentive to perhaps the overly optimistic assumptions in Enlightenment philosophy that informed Constitution writing and continue to inform democratic institutions, that a world in which in the third decade of the 21st century, a quarter of registered voters can believe a conspiracy theory that has absolutely no foundation in the truth and is so outrageous as to stretch credibility, right? That's a world in which the Enlightenment is not panning out in the way in which the philosophers of the 18th century or the Democrats of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century assumed that it would. And so it's time to begin thinking about the implications of the fact that perhaps our political system has its roots in assumptions that no longer hold. And I want to be as clear as possible. My suggestion to you is not that we abandon democracy or scale back our democratic aspirations, so much as that we learn the lessons of the last couple hundred years and of the contemporary social sciences and philosophy and attempt to do better in the way in which we institutionalize democracy. And so I'm going to then focus today on, for another couple minutes, the Supreme Court, but now not in particular Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, so much as the court itself. And I'm going to use as a way into this discussion and as the primary focus, the fact that Joe Biden's Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court of the United States issued its report in December of last year. And just by way of context, if you don't remember or haven't been paying a lot of attention to this, when Joe Biden ran to be president, several of his rivals called, when I say rivals, on the Democratic primary, several of the people who he was contesting with for the Democratic nomination called for expanding the Supreme Court. And Biden himself did not endorse that position, but as a kind of compromise, as a kind of concession to the left, and I'll talk in a moment about why I think it's actually a good concession, Biden agreed to set up a commission to study proposals for reforming the Supreme Court. That commission was put together early in his presidency. I would say it contained generally moderate constitutional law scholars, people on the middle left and middle right. They heard from a large number of witnesses, and in December, they issued their report. But the report did not get much attention, in part because it didn't make concrete recommendations for reform, because it was not charged to do that. It was asked to discuss different proposals for reform in order to set up a conversation going forward. And I think in part Biden didn't want concrete proposals because he didn't want to be saddled with having to bring them to Congress and try to get them through the closely divided and highly polarized Congress in the United States today, or to have to not act on the basis of concrete recommendations from his commission. So instead, he asked for a discussion, not for recommendations. Here are some highlights of that discussion. And I think that the most important one to recognize is that basically there was a consensus on the part of the members of the commission and on the part of the witnesses that they brought to their inquiry that the Supreme Court is facing a legitimacy crisis in the 21st century. And the crux of the problem here is that for the Supreme Court to be regarded as legitimate, the justices have to be seen as something other than politicians who don black robes in order to evade electoral accountability, right? That is to say that the court itself has to be seen as a distinct kind of institution, one not doing ordinary partisan work. The justices, therefore, have to be perceived to be something other than partisan hacks. And the work that the justices, I think, are legitimately regarded as doing in our democratic constitutional framework is the work of interpreting the Constitution, right? And that should be not apolitical work, right? That there's no way that politics doesn't enter it, but non partisan work. The framework for interpreting the Constitution should be a matter of deeper and more lasting principle than the kinds of considerations guiding ordinary political decision making. The problem is, and the root of the crisis of legitimacy the court is experiencing today, is that fewer and fewer Americans perceive the court to be anything but a partisan institution. About 2/3 of us today think of the court and the justices on it as purely partisan, right? And this then presents what's sometimes called the counter-majoritarian difficulty. If they are just there to do partisan work, why shouldn't they be democratically accountable? Why shouldn't they be elected? And then also subject to ongoing re-election, so that if we're not happy with the way they're exercising their tremendously concentrated power, there are only 9 of them, and they get to invalidate any law, they ultimately can convince 5 justices to invalidate on constitutional grounds. They are the most concentrated, powerful, in a sense, semi-legislative institution in the country. Why, if they're just doing partisan work, do they get exempted from any mechanism of democratic accountability, right? And so this is what is eroding the confidence of many people in this country in the court. And I would just add, right, the points that I made to you last week, which is that the current majority in the court, 5 members of the court, were appointed by presidents who did not win the popular vote, right? Who are in office only because of the way the Electoral College works, that they are confirmed by a Senate in which the majority of the members of the Senate represent roughly 25% of the population overall. And so again, this is an institution for amplifying minority influence on politics, and it appears to be a highly concentrated, highly unrepresentative, highly non-responsive institution. Maybe it's time to think about whether we can repair it in order to save it, in order to rescue the Supreme Court from the legitimacy crisis it's founding. It appears that it is incapable of rescuing itself. And so I think, in a sense, the most important takeaway from the report is the fact that we are beginning to at least think seriously about the necessity of reform in order to rescue the legitimacy of the Supreme Court in 21st century democratic politics. And that is, I think, in and of itself, an idea that is going to take time to gain traction, gain broader support, gain momentum, but that we might 10 years from now be pointing back to this report as the inception of a movement that may by then have gathered enough steam that reform becomes a mainstream idea. Having said all of that, let me then preview for a moment some of the reforms the Commission considers. Among them, term limits for Supreme Court justices. And I think the critical thing to note here is that in the first 50 years of the court, the average term of a Supreme Court justice was 14 years. Over the last 50 years, it has been more than double that. The average is now 29 years. So that indicates that people are joining the court in, let us say, 2020, and continuing to serve to 2050, 2060, and that given when they join the court, there's a very good likelihood that the culture, the society, the kinds of legal issues, as well as the views of the majority, have shifted dramatically since they were appointed to the court, and hence a real danger that the court moves very far out of alignment with the mainstream of democratic public opinion because the justices are staying on the court for so long. So one mechanism to address this is to allow them enough time on the court for them to learn the ropes, to have their ideas evolve, for them to be insulated from ordinary political pressures, but not make it a lifelong term. Second idea is expanding the court. And here the commission notes that the court was expanded a couple times in its early history, but its 9-judge membership has been in place for a very long time now, over a century, practically 150 years. And that when we look at the other places in the world that have well-functioning Supreme Courts, it appears that we are an outlier, right? We are more than twice as big as every other society on this list, and yet we have the second fewest number of judges. If you have, say, 16 judges, as the German High Court does, and it is a very well-regarded High Court, or 12, as the UK's and Belgium's do, and again, well-regarded high courts, you get a greater diversity of views, you have more need for compromise, and in a sense, you take the pressure off of each nomination. When it's only 9, each one becomes freighted with tremendous significance. This is 1/9 of the power to make perhaps some of the most important decisions in our society. Why not spread that power a little bit more widely and thereby make it a little bit less concentrated in fewer individuals? Now, the third idea, and this is the one I think that is, in a sense, the most provocative, the most radical, and also the most interesting. Its main advocate is a man named Jamal Green, who's a scholar at Columbia University Law School, is to follow the German model. And so not only does Germany have more judges on its Supreme Court, but it serves as an en banc, or paneled institution, meaning that its members are not permanently on the court, but as opposed to that, Germany has a relatively large federal appellate bench, and the members of the Supreme Court circulate from that bench onto the court and then back off into the appellate federal judiciary. And the result is that each member of the Supreme Court serves for 4 years and is one of, in our case, I believe there are 179 appellate judges in the federal judiciary. Their influence would be much less as individuals. And it's not just that. If you are Clarence Thomas or Samuel Alito, you know that the decisions that you write today will be upheld by you and 4 or 5 other justices who will likely be on the court for quite a while longer. Many of them maybe another 20 or 30 years, as long as their natural lives last, right? And therefore, you don't really have to consider persuading anyone other than those 4 or 5 people to join your opinion. If, on the other hand, you're on a court where 4 years from now, you and the people who joined your decision are going to be off the court, and a randomly selected alternative court is going to be reconstituted, you have to write a decision not only to persuade a larger number of justices, maybe 16, but also to persuade those justices who are going to cycle onto the court next time. And Green and others maintain that when you have this kind of rotation in and out of the Supreme Court, you tend to get more moderate, better reasoned, and more compromising in the high court decisions, because they have to persuade not only the people you already know, but the next round to populate the court and the round after that, right? And one of the examples that Green and other points to is the much more moderate handling of the abortion issue in the German or the Canadian Supreme Courts, and the ways in which this has, in a sense, led abortion to be much less the lightning rod culture war issue that it is in the United States and those other contexts, to have become part of the background settled law of their society. And again, to not lose the forest for the trees, it seems to me that one of the things we should be thinking about in the beginning of the middle of the 21st century is how we can rescue our system of constitutional government from being dragged down into the gutters of political polarization that increasingly seem to characterize our everyday electoral politics. And that this broader idea that democracy is not intrinsically and permanently forever stable, right? It's not eternal once institutionalized. Rather, it tends to be fragile. It needs to be maintained, and maintaining it requires thinking through the challenges to it that are present in the current historical moment that may not have been present at the time of the founding of these institutions. And so having a more reformist attitude, a more gradualist approach to the idea of a living constitution and evolving institutions seems to me to be one of the lessons that we should be drawing from examining the forces that diminish democracy. And those forces are on display. And in case on display in our current politics, in case we didn't need another reminder, we got one again this week when it was revealed that the panel looking into the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol has received from Mark Meadows text messages sent to him by Ginny Thomas, the wife of Justice Clarence Thomas, advocating for the overturning of the 2020 presidential election results and endorsing conspiracy theories. And again, I just think for large portions of the American public, this serves to further discredit the idea that the Supreme Court is a nonpartisan institution. If we are going to maintain this institution and the good work that it can do for us, please note that there are a whole bunch of redistricting cases working their way through the court right now. And districts drawn to maximize partisan advantage by both Democrats and Republicans are being invalidated by the courts. And in a sense, the courts in that case are doing the good work of trying to preserve the rules of the democratic game for a more fractious environment. We need those kinds of institutional stabilizing mechanisms to work in moments like this. That means we need to attend to their health. All right, let me stop for a moment. I'm about to move on to more economic stuff, but before I do, thoughts or questions? I just spent a lot of time talking at you. Anybody have something they want to discuss at this juncture, this point in the lecture? If not, I will continue and maybe you can collect your questions for the end. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody. If you are trying to ask a question, unmute yourself. Feel free to ask it even when we're not in this format, but while I'm with my slides. Okay. Oh, Wilma, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Your hand.
What would be the possible means of implementation of such a report?
Yeah, great question. And please note the report doesn't make recommendations. So the ideas would have to be endorsed and chosen, selected, and then we would have to begin to implement them. And one of the issues here is whether or not this could be done through ordinary legislation as opposed to via constitutional amendment. And I think most people believe that constitutional amendment is too high a bar to clear in contemporary circumstances. It's hard enough to get ordinary legislation passed on controversial issues. And so I think everything I've discussed with you, the commission was of the opinion it's controversial, it's not entirely clear, but that ordinary legislation might be sufficient, because although the Constitution indicates that there should be a Supreme Court, it gives Congress discretion to determine how the Supreme Court should be constituted, right? And so ordinary legislation might be able to do this. Now, having said that, the bar to passing ordinary legislation is pretty high these days. And so there is a kind of chicken and egg problem here. If part of what I'm suggesting is that we want to rely more on the judiciary to save us from escalating partisanship dooming our democracy, then part of the question is, how do we get institutions currently paralyzed by extreme partisanship to shore up the judiciary? But my sense is that there's a better chance of that than there is at scaling back hyperpartisanship in this historical moment. So I think, in other words, that there's a chance that this could be pursued within this decade. And that's not exactly reassuring if you're focused on the politics of 2022, but it's better than not having any prospects for reform. And that the commission, we have to hope, is the beginning of a conversation that will slowly gain traction, perhaps as it becomes more and more apparent that if it doesn't, the Supreme Court is in trouble, and with it, perhaps our democracy. All right, anybody else? So the short answer, Wilma, is maybe just ordinary legislation. Okay, let me get back to it. And the next thing I want to talk with you about is some economic news. And let's start with the job report that came out yesterday. And so we haven't talked about this stuff for a while together. And please note that the job report from a month ago was very strong. The job report from the beginning of April, looking at what happened in March, is also very strong. That between those 2 months, we are very close now to complete recovery from all of the job loss caused by the pandemic recession, right? And please remember, this was a steep and deep decline in jobs in the United States in the spring of 2020. And one of the things to note here, right, the leisure and hospitality workforce, which had been really lagging for the first year and a half of the pandemic, is now coming back all the more strongly as people are starting to go out to dinner and stay in hotels again. That the result is that the unemployment rate is basically now right to where it was at the pre-pandemic level, that labor force participation is almost to where it was at the pre-pandemic level. Lots of signs of real strength in the American labor market. And I want to suggest that this is obviously good news for workers, and yet it is, in another sense, deeply ambivalent. And the reason that it's ambivalent is because higher wages can create inflationary pressure. And we are at a moment of relatively high inflation. That is amplified by the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, because Russia is the third largest exporter of petroleum products in the world. Russia and the Ukraine are two of the largest exporters of cereals like wheat and corn, especially to the cheaper markets of the world. And so we should be worried not only about inflation and also hunger. Let me just show you a little bit of data on what this looks like. This is the most recent forecast for the consumer price index. And as you can see, the consumer price index in the first quarter of 2022 is really as high as it has been in 50 years. These are essentially levels of inflation approaching 8%. One way to put that is those are kind of 1970s levels of inflation. And the forecast, and of course a forecast is tricky business. There's no crystal ball on this, is that although inflation will come under control eventually by 2023, it's going to remain high for much of the rest of this year. And I would note two things. Inflation causes both uncertainty and misery. It erodes the value, the purchasing value of people's cash, of their savings. And it also creates an environment of uncertainty and anxiety in which you just don't know if the income you have today will be sufficient to cover the bills you're going to have tomorrow. And that is a difficult position for many people to be in. So we should anticipate that the coming year is going to be a year of deep economic anxiety for many people. And please note that that coincides with an election year, right? And so an election year that already favored the Republicans because the Democrats are in control of the presidency and Congress. And in those circumstances, there tends to be a pushback against the party currently in charge. You add to that very high levels of inflation, very high levels of economic anxiety. And this really does not look good in terms of the political prospects for the Democrats. You then add to what the war in the Ukraine is doing to gas and in particular diesel prices. So these are gas prices. And as you can see, the California rate is extraordinarily high. The average rate for the country is up about 50% from where it was at the beginning of the year. The average rate for diesel fuel is up about 100% from where it was at the beginning of the year. And diesel is what is used to get your goods from the port to the store that you purchase them in, or from the port to the Amazon fulfillment center that you purchase them from, and also what is used to get those cargo ships from the places the goods are manufactured to the ports where they then get to the store. And so the diesel prices tend to have very strong knock-on effects. And the worry here then is that the kind of inflation that we're experiencing, which people had for quite a while, not everyone, but many people been speculating, was transitory or short-term inflation, may now really have entered the terrain of being long-term inflation. And to differentiate just for a moment, short-term inflation tends to be driven by the supply side of the economy. At least that's the way I understand it, in the sense that the things that you want to purchase, there are kinks in the supply chain, you're unable to get them, and therefore, because demand exceeds supply, the price goes up, right? And so with the pandemic, with therefore the disruption of global supply chains as the pandemic roiled different parts of the world economy at different times, with a highly integrated global manufacturing sector requiring goods arriving just in time from all over the world, that created shortages and shortages drive inflation on particular goods, right? Automobiles, because the chips required to make them work the way they're supposed to work are no longer as readily available. There's a shortage of them. And so there ends up being a shortage of automobiles. Automobile prices go up, right? But that still should be solved as soon as either the pandemic recedes or the supply chain issues are addressed. The alternative here is long-term structural inflation. And one way to put that is that there's just too much money in the economy. Too much money chasing too little goods is the mantra you tend to hear as description of inflation. And it is increasingly appearing that with the job market getting tighter, wages going up, people have more money. You add that to the fact that we had really the largest stimulus spending package since World War II to address the pandemic recession, which is in part what's generating all of these jobs. The worry is that this may be systemic inflation as opposed to sector specific inflation. And I now want to pivot back to the broader themes that I've been talking with you about today. And one of the things that I suggested in looking at Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson's nomination hearings is that there were a lot of grievance politics moments in those hearings. And this has become a very successful recipe for the Republican Party and for right-wing populists throughout the world. Part of the sense here is in this country that as we become diverse, as we become more complicated in terms of our racial and gender and sexual politics, people just feel less secure, less like the world that they know is the world that they still live in, less like there are clear norms that govern the most important social roles that we play, and therefore threatened. But I want to add to that, this has been compounded, amplified, multiplied by a decline in economic security for a large sector of the American workforce, especially for people who do not have a college degree and so do not tend to work in the knowledge economy. As our economy has deindustrialized, the formerly very good manufacturing jobs have dried up, become much less well paid, much less secure, much less likely to come with good benefits, stable working hours, paid vacations. And so people feel increased economic vulnerability. And I guess you'd have to be a better social scientist than I see around us right now to know exactly how to assign responsibility for the politics of grievance. How much of it comes from economic insecurity? How much of it comes from a sense of normative threat as a result of cultural changes? But what seems clear to me is that the two overlap, amplify each other, and that anything that increases economic anxiety is also going to amplify, create very fertile conditions for the politics of grievance as well, right? And so if we want the Democrats, capital D, to do well here, but also Democrats, small d, to do well worldwide, we should take seriously that increased economic inequality and vulnerability are leading many to question the legitimacy, the responsiveness, the efficacy of democracy. It is eroding faith in the ability of democratic institutions to cater to the core pocketbook issues that many people care most about. And so again, my suggestion to you is not only because we should care about the economic security of large portions of our population, but also because it's only in conditions where the middle class, the working class feels economically secure, that they tend to be stably supportive of democracy, that we should be concerned about the inflationary pressures on our economy, not only from an economic, but also from a political perspective. Let me turn finally for a moment to what's happening in the Ukraine. And here I want to discuss a very fluid situation that I at this point have spent a long time discussing with you, and so I'm not going to try to add much more information today about the battle on the ground. I will point out to you what we seem to be seeing is the Russian troops withdrawing from the northeast of the Ukraine, especially seeming to relieve the assault on Kyiv, to regroup and reposition their troops to the east. One of the big questions is this a permanent and lasting trend, or is this merely a shift in strategy in the short term, and the Russians will mount a new assault on Kyiv to try to remove the government of Vladimir Zelensky and the military command at some point later in this war? Unsure, but what we do see right now, at least, is Russian troops withdrawing, repositioning. The result is that the Ukrainians are able to mount effective counterattacks, especially around the capital. And if we zoom in on the capital, what we see is roughly a dozen towns and suburbs that have been recaptured in the last few days by the Ukrainians that had been formerly held by the Russians. Having said all of that, I want to shift focus to conclude today from the Ukraine to Russia. And I have said to you already that this is an asymmetrical war, with the West waging economic warfare against Russia at the same time that Russia is waging battlefield warfare against the Ukraine. And I think when you hear that, there's a natural tendency to hear economic warfare as a metaphor and not necessarily as a literal reality. And so I want to spend a moment at the end of the lecture today really drilling down on the idea that economic warfare is an instrument of warfare, especially in a world that is as economically interdependent as our world is today. And so I gave you a little bit of evidence last time we were together about the extent of the deglobalization of the Russian economy. And so these are all corporations that have either withdrawn or suspended operations or scaled back from their operations in Russia, including some of the largest foreign corporations operating in Russia. And I think one way to describe the effect of this, we've seen the images of Ukrainian shopping malls that have been bombed by the Russians and that are reduced to rubble. And we know this is part of the Russian military strategy against the Ukraine. If you were to go to a comparable shopping mall in Russia today, I think what you would see is that its physical plant is intact, but that its commercial face is almost as devastated as the Ukrainian shopping mall that's been hit by munitions, right? And so I think we have to take a little bit more literally the idea that this is warfare and that it is escalating and that it is devastating the Russian economy. The estimates are that the Russian GDP has shrunk by 15 to 20% in the last month. A few minutes ago, I was speaking with you about the anxiety that inflation provokes. The Russians are experiencing hyperinflation now that the ruble has been dramatically devalued. They're also experiencing a loss of many of the goods that they took for granted that come from the global economy, and a severe economic contraction. And I want to be as clear as possible. The people who are best able to insulate themselves from the effects of hyperinflation, severe economic contraction, deglobalization, are, of course, the economic elite, who have deep pockets, who can spend more, who can go on the black market, who can hoard and then use their supplies over time. The people who suffer most from the kind of economic damage the West is inflicting on Russia are ordinary people. And the poorer they are, the worse off they become. And so I want to really emphasize that the damage that we are doing to Russia right now, because the Putin regime has launched an unjustifiable, aggressive, inhumane, criminal campaign, war against the Ukraine. The people we are damaging are not the people responsible for this war, but the people who are caught up in politics that they have almost no say in, right? And I want to flag that issue for two reasons. One of them is to raise the question of, should we regard these economic sanctions as permanent? Essentially, this is the punishment that's going to be visited on Russia as long as Putin is in charge, because of the crimes that his government and military have committed in the Ukraine. And if we look at Venezuela, if we look at North Korea, if we look at Iran, if we look at Afghanistan, this tends to be the history of economic sanctions in the way that the United States has used them. I'll just point out to you, if you remember back 30 years ago, in the aftermath of Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, right? Economic sanctions were placed on the Iraqi regime. There are estimates that as many as 500,000 children died as a result of the poverty, misery, and shortages, lack of access to medicine, etc., that those sanctions caused. I'm not convinced that those high numbers are accurate, but even if you reduce it by half, 250,000 children killed by economic sanctions imposed to punish a regime. Who really suffers when we impose sanctions? As much as we are outraged, morally offended by what Putin is doing, should we therefore punish the Russian people? And again, I want to conclude with one last idea here, which I think is linked to everything else I've been saying to try to sew these diverse themes together. And that is, one of the things we're seeing in the last month is Putin's approval rating going up in Russia, not down. Independent polling, which is a hard, tricky business in Russia today, indicates that whereas Putin's approval rating was in the low to mid 60s before the war, it's in the low 80s today. And it does appear that there's a kind of circling of the wagons around Putin going on in Russia, in which the Russian people are saying, the West is attacking us. We are at war with them. And under those circumstances, we are going to support our leader, right? And so not only in terms of a humanitarian perspective, but also in terms of a democracy promoting perspective, it's far from clear to me that sustaining the sanctions makes sense if Russia backs out of the war on the Ukraine. And perhaps one of the things we could encourage Putin to do to find a way to peace, to a cessation of hostilities, would be to indicate that at least the most punishing sanctions would be lifted if he were to cease aggression in the Ukraine. I'll conclude by just thinking about then, again, the big theme. How can we promote democracy in the 21st century, given what we've learned about some of the limits and the ways in which we've conceived of democracy in the past? And there's a literature that suggested that economic interdependence, the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet communist experiment, would produce a convergence on liberal democratic capitalism the world over. And the result would be peace, among other things, because we would be so economically interdependent that there would be a very strong elite peace lobby saying, don't mess up the markets, the supply chains, etc. Now, I think, again, this has proven naive, optimistic, sanguine. But having said that, that doesn't mean that the ideas can't be honed and redeployed. And I'm interested in particular in the idea of not just organic interdependence, but engineered interdependence to counter war and promote greater freedom. And so one of the, I think, ideas that could come out of this is, if we're not going to just permanently cripple the Russian economy in the way in which, for instance, we have the Venezuelan economy, if we're going to try to use economic carrots as well as sticks, how can we engineer, design our economic carrots so that they not only incentivize Putin to end this awful war, but also to move the Russian economy more fully into the global economy, and perhaps in so doing to create the conditions of prosperity that seem to be associated with greater pressure for less autocratic forms of government. All right, I'll stop there. Happy to hear the questions or thoughts you might have. Obviously, I just threw a lot at you today. Who wants to start us out? Go ahead, Flossie. You are still muted, Flossie. You got to hold that space bar down, remember?
Muted. Now I am. Two things. Judge Jackson will shortly become Justice Jackson, and that is a very good thing. The other side of it is that somebody like Cruz, I won't describe him, he will use her ascendancy to argue that this is the thing that his side doesn't want. This is proof of where we're heading, a Black woman in the Supreme Court. And we look at the Supreme Court, and there's a white woman trying to undermine democracy. We really are in an amazing period of history. If it isn't one thing, it's another. If you can sit back and enjoy it, fine, but it's cruel. I just wanted to toss that out.
Apparently there's a Chinese curse, at least so I'm told. May you live in interesting times.
Yes.
Right, we certainly live in interesting times. And Flossie, I think it's worthwhile noting that I think you're exactly right, that in a sense, Ted Cruz is already using the nomination of Judge Brown Jackson, soon to be Justice Brown Jackson, to the Supreme Court to rally the right in opposition, not just to her nomination, but to what it represents, to the erosion of privilege, etc. But having said that, please note that according to most polls, upwards of 60% of Americans support her being on the Supreme Court. And so although there is a large and mobilized minority who oppose it, they are not the majority. right? And I do think it's important to remind ourselves of that, and that this is progress, right? That this was inconceivable 50 years ago, and it is on the cusp of being our reality today.
And what will happen to Clarence Thomas?
I suspect absolutely nothing, right? You know, he is appointed for life. He either recuses himself or resigns or is impeached and convicted. I don't think there are very high likelihoods to any of those outcomes. So he remains on the Supreme Court as long as he wants to, or until he completes his natural lifespan. Yeah. Wilma, you've got your hand up again. Go ahead. You have to unmute.
You spoke about what the majority of people in this country want and like, but the fact that our institutions, the failure of our institutions to be truly democratic is what's the big problem. We're not we are no longer, our representation no longer reflects the actual mood and wishes of the American public. So I just don't know what to do about that except notice it.
Yeah, well, noticing it is a first step, obviously not a satisfactory solution to the problem. I focused today a little bit on Supreme Court reform, and the idea that something that I think would have been very hard to even consider when Barack Obama was president, right, is now on the table when Joe Biden is president. And so we need to reform the Senate, and the principle of equal representation by state. I spoke of the discrepancy between the terms that Supreme Court justices were serving in the first 50 years of the court and now are serving, and the fact that they've got twice as long. You can also look at the discrepancy between the population of the smallest state and the population of the biggest state at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, and compare it with today, right? And at that point, it was 7-1. Today, it's about 40-1, right? And so again, the principle of equal representation in the Senate of states seems to reflect a social world that we no longer live in. And the idea of, for instance, having more populous states have 3 senators, while less populous states have 2 senators, I think looks like totally a snowball in hell right now, a snowflake in hell. But having said that, give it time, give time for the frustrations to build, give time for the institutions to suffer, and maybe it will move from being pie in the sky to being a realistic possibility, to being something we actually accomplish. That's the hope. Having said that, I think you're right, that it's a lot easier to observe the problems than it is to identify the political mechanisms via which we could solve those problems. That is the moment we're in.
Yep.
All right, everybody. Good as always to be with you. I look forward to seeing you again next week. Take care. One thing about living in interesting times, we will have plenty to talk about. Take care, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.